right now, for our keynote address on ethical framework for responsible AI, we've got with us Virginie Martins, ethical AI and SDG expert, European Union, Belgium. Well, Virginie, with 15 years of expertise in strategic content and advisory, she's someone who's acquired an expertise in AI and innovation towards sustainable development goals with a focus on social and gender bias and ethical concerns. Well, if the audience has any questions, you may type it during the course of the address in the Q&A tab, and we'll take it forward to Virginie at the end of the session if time allows. Well, with this, I'd now like to invite Virginie Martins on your stage and screen. Over to you, Virginie.
Thank you, Bhavana. Thank you for the World AI Show to have me once again, and thank you for the QATAR Finance Center to have us today. It's a great pleasure for me to talk about ethical and responsible AI today, and what I would like to do is to connect the dots between an ethical approach, a technological approach, and also in relation with human rights and ethical concerns when it comes to developing within your corporation or at the state level ethical frameworks. Please let me share with you my screen and my presentation for today. Here. So first, let's start with few trends. The AI economy is forecasted to reach out to 157 trillion US dollars by 2013, and the annual growth rate of funding is 48%. In 2019 only, 70 billion US dollars have been invested in AI technologies and in AI applications. We are also seeing different trends on the market, which are relevant for our conversation today. First, there is an exponential increase in the number of patents that has been filed, 94% of them being from the developed and rich countries, and 60% of them being from the United States of America only. There is another switch that is happening and that we have seen today is that most of the research now is happening within corporation and not only in academia, as it was the case in the very beginning of the AI application and until the 2000 years. Another thing also that we are seeing that has of relevance for you today is that nowadays AI is really considered as a soft power within the states, within governments. Each state is trying to reposition itself and to remarket itself within the multilateral context. For example, India, in its strategic paper back in 2018, positioned herself as being the back office of the AI application, being very in the forefront of it. And in the 2018 QATAR strategy, we have seen that QATAR is also positioning itself as a global hub for excellence. All those things is interesting from an ethical point of view because it does influence at a state level the vision on the policy and the kind of ethical policies they would like to reach out. It is so important that we have seen also a lot of development over the years and coming with a lot of ethical issues, a lot of ethical breaches. One of the most famous and really related to one of the last election was the 2018 Cambridge Analytica, and most recently the ethical concern about facial recognition in the public space, with the CEO of IBM taking a stand and refusing to develop further AI application with facial recognition if there was not a stronger ethical benchmark, a stronger ethical framework, and also stronger policies at the state level and the international level. We come to a stand that I think there is an overall consensus about all the ethical risks and all the ethical breaches that we have seen from perpetrating and increasing inequalities and bias by making the inequality systemic and permanent. Also the lack of access of the certain population which exclude them from this growth, from this progress. It's not the case in QATAR because 94% of the population in QATAR do have access to the internet. So they won't be considered in the QATAR market by such risk, but it is the right risk in all the Arabic region and also in Africa and in some countries in Europe. We also have another ethical issue that is quite big, which is the lack of accountability, also related to the lack of transparency of what we call in a technical jargon, the black boxes. This is even more a risk that more and more governments, and it's the case in QATAR, in the Arabic region, in India, are using AI applications to provide public services and to reach out to the citizens. If you don't have a clear understanding of what is the coding, what is the algorithm used, and who was in charge of the algorithm, how are you going to trace back the accountability? Who is going to be responsible if you don't know who has developed your coding and your algorithm within your organization? It is especially of high importance in a public context, whether you are a corporation or states, because at the end of the process, of the judicial process, it's always the state who is responsible and has a responsibility to protect its citizens. And therefore, we see more and more why AI is a soft power and does influence also the way corporation needs to look at their ethical framework and the ethical processes. All those ethical issues are much more related to all the applications that also brought consensus and are on the left side of my presentation, from contact tracing, and we have seen the different ethical conversation with the COVID stop applications during those strange times that we are under. Facial recognitions, I mentioned the problem and the stand taken by the IBM CEOs, but also the blockchain, whether in developing countries, but also in developed countries. To the point that today, in 2020, there is an average of 250 code of ethics worldwide. As you can also see here, there has been a shift in the perception of the importance of the ethical codes within the tech companies from 2018. And this coincides with the large issuance of national strategic position from the states and also a strengthening of the European legislation around ethical guidelines, but also a stand from all public actors, the civil society, and an awareness that you cannot develop AI application and take from just a technology point of view. You really know how to look at the socio-economic impact, the human rights impact, the rights impact, and everything is starting to be so embedded that we can't divide anymore all those things. What is also interesting to see here is that most of the issues we have seen previously are also reflecting in the different code of ethics, from fairness, transparency, and accountability. It really shows and demonstrates that everyone seems having a common understanding, at least of the common terms and the common issues that we face when developing an ethical framework. Based on that, I also wanted to give you a few, I would say, key points of reference when you try to think and really engage into this ethical process. So there is first the general application of AI, which you can see in my first circle from a macro level, which was at the very beginning of the process around AI, where the technology was neutral and it was much about fundamental research. Then, over the time, when we realized that there were a lot of consequences from an ethical perspective, we developed a framework, and that's where you call ethical and responsible AI. It's all the applications that are developed, monitored, under the consideration of ethics, whether there is an accountability or not system. Then within this category of ethical and responsible AI, you have another narrower category, which is AI for good, that is not only AI applications that are developed with an ethical and responsible framework, but also are aiming at achieving the goals of the 2013 agenda towards the SDGs. The difference between the strict AI application with no ethical regards and the AI for good, I think it's really the intensity and the level of the socio-economic approach you do have. And it also does correspond with an evolution of how we have perceived person within this process. At the very beginning here, data was looked at something very objective and neutral, and individuals were not looked as individuals, but as, I would say, scientific target for data. And therefore, that's why we didn't really see the impact on the human being. Then when we had the first big steps in AI, we realized that you can use AI to personalize the journey to your customers and your clients. That's where we realized that it's not just any individual, it's customers, it's individuals. And therefore, we started on the same time to develop ethical and responsible framework, because you do have an impact on the life of your consumers by trying to predict their choices, by trying to analyze their taste and try to make some persona from a marketing perspective. When the AI application developed so much that even governments were using them, or that some of them that were developed for military purposes started to be used on the broader scale, which was the case for facial recognition and blockchain, for example, we realized that not only do your application and the product does intertwine with consumers and with economic and social rights and corporate rights, but also to fundamental freedoms, because you do engage with citizens and beneficiaries. And that's where you see really the evolution from AI, ethical AI, and AI for good. And now that we are asking and going forward a much more stricter ethical framework when it comes to AI. To give you also, and connecting the dots and trying to give you a micro and micro level when you look at it from a corporate perspective, you have a micro level that correspond and coincide with the general framework, whether at the UN level or European level, which are generic by definition because they need to be implemented everywhere and in every context. That's why for your corporation that will coincide with your corporate ethical framework. This corporate ethical framework is a bit like a mission statement about your ethics and applicable to your headquarters, to your affiliates company, and whatever the unit and the department. Then you have another context where you need to be bit more contextualized and take a lot of factors into consideration. It's a case when you take into consideration your market within a region, within a country, but also the differences and the disparities within your unit and within a product. Because not all the products have to follow the same ethical guidelines. Some of them have to have very specific ethical processes, and you can't really duplicate. You really have to look at what is the product, what is the market, and what are the possible consequences, and always adapt your ethical framework and reasoning. Then at the very micro level, it's your core ethical principle or the core human rights principle. For example, Google has shipped since 2018, and now among the GAFAM, they want to be seen as a champion in privacy. This is their core ethical principle, Google being the champion of privacy. So what is yours? Really try to understand and to focus on what would you like to be known for. When you also try to make a parallel, again, for you to always link that to the bigger picture and make ethics much more operationalized and much more pragmatic for you. You have the general human rights international principle, whether international convention, international regulations, which again, it's an ethical framework, and then you translated that into your sector of your industry. Nowadays, the common word used throughout the industries and sector is trust. But if you try again to sequence that and try understand what does it mean trust for my company, for my product, for my customer, you will see that again, we go back to the first slide I have shown you with the same words, safety, fighting against violence and discrimination, and accountability. But if you really also look deeper from a law perspective, an ethical perspective, safety is not just safety, it's privacy, which is a fundamental freedom. Some of countries, like India, for example, have even made privacy as a constitutional right. So that's where you see that the more AI applications are entering into the realm of society, the more we are going to improve or at least upload, I would say, some rights to fundamental freedoms. And that you will see more and more of the correlation. For example, also bias, what is it? It's also related to the human rights principle or international principle that we shouldn't allow discrimination based on race, ethnicities, gender, nationalities, and religion. So that's how I wanted to really connect the dots for you between words that are used in the industries and really concepts in international law and European law. When we look at QATAR, I would say that QATAR already has a lot of strengths based on the 2018 national strategy. First, because they're already adopting a very contextualized approach to AI, and therefore it does support the work of the corporation in the market. They want to promote their tradition. They want to use their Arabic language to bring the diversity within the AI application and really have applications that are reflecting the market, which I think is also key for other stakeholders within this organization who are much more focused on trying to tailor-make their products to their customers. They also already anticipated that every new region now has to position itself. So as I said, India wants to be a bit of the back office of the AI. Canada, the UK, China, early on in the race of competition for AI, position themselves as the global leaders. And now QATAR is, since 2018, really trying to be a hub for excellence, driving talents toward it and really be at the forefront of innovation. You won't face in QATAR the problem of accessibility, and therefore there is less risk for people to be discriminated because, again, 94% of the population is connected or have an access to the internet. And then in the national AI strategy of QATAR, there are three basic ethical principles that are key for them, which is the micro level I have shown you on the different slides, which is fairness, transparency, and accountability. So keep that in mind also before going to kind of a checklist of everything you should ask yourself when you're trying to implement an ethical frameworks. Think of also three waves when it comes to regulation around AI. The first really very early on wave was the Asimov laws of robotics. I know a bit updated. I know some people think it's too simple in comparison to the complexity of AI application, and yet if you really look at the 4 questions and the reasoning behind Asimov laws of robotics, you already have a bit of the framework and the thinking process that you should have when you think about ethics and its impacts. The second way that you already have to look at it now from a corporate perspective, even though you are developing products, it's all the international conventions. all the international protocols, all the European regulation around ethics, but also more broadly, again, human rights and fundamental freedoms principle, because whether you like it or not, at some point, it's going to come up into the conversation. So the better you anticipate those conversations, the better you integrate them into your ethical framework, and therefore you do mitigate the risk of litigation, or you do mitigate the risk on your corporate social responsibility and on your reputation, and you can be seen as a leader and a pioneer on your market. Then the third wave is everything around ethics. So here I have mentioned the UN Innovation Principles that have been updated in 2019. Why? Because they do apply to every AI application towards the SDGs. But most importantly, it was really an effort between the GAFAM, other technical companies, the UN, state actors, so a real multi-stakeholders process that enables to have a clear understanding of where ethics interfere, where ethics enter into your process, from the ideation to the implementation and to the scaling up. And everything has been tested, piloting, and they reviewed it. So I think it's also a good understanding for you to have a human-centered approach and how to do it, and really always making the connection between the corporate world and what we see in international relations that now are becoming very much intricated. When you talk about implementing concretely within your corporation, I think adopting a lean approach is key. You have on the right side of my screen the model that has been developed by the European Commission, really going through all the AI system cycle, again, from the design, ideation, to the implementation and the scaling up. And you want to have two approaches, a systemic approach and a contextualized approach also. The systemic approach is how to standardize your key ethical principle. What is it that I want to champion within my chain of development, within my engineers, within my top governance, and what are the keys that are going to be implemented at the headquarter level in the affiliates company, even though the affiliate companies in different regions of the world are going to contextualize it and apply it to the market. Then you also want to have an iterative process. Again, I think I already mentioned it, but I'm going to repeat it. It's not because you implement a fair and efficient ethical framework and process for one product on one market that this experiment or this scaling up is applicable in all sectors. Again, if you go back to facial recognition, we have seen that facial recognition can be good to have access to certain very private services like banking. But then transferring that into the public space, even though you do follow the same ethical process and the same line of development, does not raise the same ethical concerns, and therefore you can't duplicate. And I think there is also this trend nowadays within the corporate world sometimes because you tested something, an application in one particular sector for one particular target group, thinking that you can enlarge that experiment and transferring that to another market. When it comes to ethics, you really need to always have this, I would say, to deep dive into the process and not take anything for granted, even though you can standardize the way you do it and who will be involved and what will be the different steps towards that. But you always want to redo the experiment. And that's why I think it's key. Also, to finish, because I think I'm always due with my time, always try to see do you have a clear stewardship at the national level when you're trying to enter into a market, but also within your headquarters. Is my leadership and my governance here? Yes, with AI, you really also would like to have a top-down and bottom-up approach, but really key when it comes to ethics and standing by your principle comes from the top. Governance, having a clear ethical guidelines. So again, what are your key ethical fundamental principles? Privacy, transparency, fairness, and what do you do internally to make it happen? Have a clear chain of accountability from the coder to the lawyer in charge, to the marketing person in charge, to the top decision makers. How are you going to retrace the decision-making process within your company and go back to that person if something is missing, or just to sometimes debrief with that person and try to improve the process. Capacity building is key. I think it was already tackled this morning with some of the speakers. Trying also at the very beginning to have a clear understanding of how you're going to arbitrate if there is an ethical issues before the problem arises. It's better when you launch your ethical framework to envision all the possibilities and know what will be the criteria under which you will refuse to develop an application. That's what IBM did with the facial recognition, but you would like to anticipate that. Also, in the same kind of process, You would like to have an external audit board who will be able to overview your ethical processes from an external perspective, because you can't always be the party and the judge of your process. You need an external outsider person or a group of persons being able to step in and maybe sometimes advise you or telling you that you are risking here when you're developing. Fit for purpose analysis, again, I think this is sometimes not looked sufficiently, especially when it comes to states. Yes, there is a large investment that is needed at the beginning, but also do not underestimate the cost of updating constantly your AI applications, in training new people within institutions. So really the question is, do we always need AI to develop and enhance the action of a corporation or service public actors? Please do look at that, because again, updating a system is very costly, and sometimes mutualizing some resources or mutualizing some data from ministries or from between ministry and some corporation could be useful. Having diverse team, I already mentioned that QATAR is very in advance to that. They really would like to have a contextualized approach, I think is key. But diverse team is necessary, but not always enough. So don't take it for granted that you won't duplicate discrimination just because you have a diverse team. Try to tap into those talent and into this diversity. How do you manage that? How do you train that? We want to have applications now that are reproducing or trying to nurture the diversity of the world. We just don't want to have a standardization of AI, which will completely erase the peculiarities of the world, from the religion to, again, the way you speak, the way you think. All the culture have something to bring to AI, and try to take that into consideration by also having innovation lab everywhere if you have a big corporation, not only in the headquarters, but also in the field, in Africa, in Qatar, in the Arabic region, because people think differently. And when you think differently, then you approach things differently and you tackle ethical issues differently. And also then to finish, try to have smart partnership. Always look for PPP, public and private partnership, always having, again, a clear line of accountability, but try to do that together. I think that's the paradox of AI. AI is standardizing a lot of things, but also bringing us together. We all need to work together from different sectors, from different backgrounds, and also from different work. As a lawyer, I get to work with engineers, with coders, and you get to work with me. You also get to work with ethicists, with people, humanitarian people. So that's the beauty of AI, and that's really should be reflected into your ethical processes. So thank you for having me today, and for the opportunity to share some insight around ethics and how to develop a pragmatic approach towards ethics.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Virginie, for joining us today at the World AI Show. It was incredible having you being a part of it. Thank you once again for your time.
Thank you.